Hi, my name is Roberto, and in this video I want to talk to you about a book that I have recently read. The title of the book, and I think you want to listen to this, is Psychology's Misuse of Statistics and Persistent Dismissal of its Critics. So it is quite an eye catcher, right? And this book was written by Professor James Lamiell. He's a recently retired professor from Georgetown University in the United States. And yeah, the book was published in 2019, so it's also quite recent and it's also quite contemporary in many ways. And now I can tell you already that the book caught my attention and kept it very, very strongly to the point that I read and went through it in just a matter of a few days. And you might think, okay, maybe that's not a surprise because I'm a psychologist, but in reality, not all psychologists are excited about all books they read, even if they are about psychology. So I just mean to say that to me it was a very special finding, and the book actually expanded my perspective on the topic of psychology, but especially of psychology as a science. And yeah, I mean the book does cover a range of wide, varied topics and themes. But to keep this video short, I will try to focus on the main theme of the book, and then I will also give you a quick overview of other themes that I found interesting and that I think all or everybody reading the book will find interesting. And I hope in that way that I motivate you a bit to take a look at the book. But okay, so that's enough of the preview. So the main topic of the book is defined by a simple word, and that is statisticism. And I will tell you about what that is now. This is actually a new concept. It's a term coined by Professor James Lamiell, and the conceptualization is quite a bit tricky, but he describes it this way in the book. I will paraphrase a bit and make it, let's say, a bit more understandable, but that's a big goal for me. Basically, statisticism is the unfortunate, ascendant, and continuing practice within mainstream psychology of assuming that the statistical structure in data sets that are comprised of responses of many individuals reveals the structure of relevant psychological processes operating in individuals. So that probably didn't make much sense yet, but to try and put it in my own words, I will say that Professor Lamiell points at something important, which is that in psychology, there is a long standing and frequent malpractice when it comes to how outcomes of statistical analysis, which come from data from groups of individuals, are interpreted. And maybe you are not that familiar with psychological research, and just to explain a bit, it is quite common that data, for example, are collected in a way that specific information about psychological variables come from different individuals. So, for example, one variable could be about their type of personality, and another one could be about their intelligence. And what often happens is that psychologists work with this data, but at the group level, because they, for example, do such things such as making average scores for subgroups, which is quite normal. And that allows psychologists to make all sorts of additional calculations and to apply a huge range of what it's called statistical tests. So the problem here is that, as Professor Lamiell puts in his book, is that once psychologists are working with group-based data and conducting analyses which are often complex on that data, then they very often lose the conceptual or the epistemological clarity about what that group level data can say about individual processes. So let's just try to keep understanding this. Just ask yourself, what is or what should be psychologist's main subject of study? Well, of course, and precisely, the matter of study is psychological processes. And those processes, and we can refer to the ones that we are really sure about or that we have evidence of as psychological laws, those are only meaningful when we put them at the level of the individual. So perhaps even this is still too abstract, but I will only say that what becomes evident when reading this book is that to realize the magnitude of statisticism really requires critical thinking, really requires careful thinking. So it does take time, and I think Professor Lamiell does a really, really good job in taking through this reasoning step by step. And I will also add, that what becomes clear is that Professor Lamiell clearly argues, but in my opinion also shows that statisticism is a big problem for psychology. And what's even more worrisome is that he also argues, and I also think he shows that, is that mainstream psychology has consistently and has unapologetically been ignoring and basically dismissing its critics. Of course, critics that often raise concerns that relate to statisticism, but even beyond that also. So each chapter of the book is, in my opinion, brilliant. I think Professor Lamiell does present more than enough reasons to explain why, and especially also how, statisticism was or has prevailed in mainstream psychology. And if you are a psychologist or you are a social scientist like myself, I anticipate you might be thinking, okay, this is all news. I know what are the do's and don'ts of a statistical analysis, and I really hope that, and also wish that that is true, because if that's the case, then great. However, I think that even after I have read this book myself, the chances are that you might be unaware of a couple of things, or that you might not be sufficiently considering several points or the magnitude of the consequences that sometimes happen from dismissing the pitfall, let's say, of statisticism. And the implications in reality, as a social scientist, is that if we approach this malpractice, they can be massive. And what Professor Lamiell shows is that they have been massive for how psychology is right now, or where it's at. The status as a science, and that's what Professor Lamiell argues, is also quite unstable. And I think anybody who is in psychology will not be totally unfamiliar with these kind of discussions. So all I can say is that if you are a social researcher, just trust me, read the book. It is quite concise, it is quite clear, it is a many times I found it to be very entertaining. And even despite the seriousness of the topic, I think it's very just fun to read, and it keeps your curiosity going throughout the chapters. But now, of course, for those outside the ring of science, you might be wondering, okay, does this book have something for me? And yeah, of course, this is an academic book, but honestly, I think it is worth reading. Perhaps a minimum requirement, I will say, is to be slightly curious about the historical developments of psychology as a science. But that being said, even without that, what I think this book can offer you is this. I think Professor Lamiell's book is kind of like a weapon of knowledge to defend our individuality. And just think that if you ever find yourself, or if you have already found yourself in a situation where you feel that you are being misjudged or misrepresented, and you suspect or you know that this is happening because somebody is making claims of knowledge about you based on data that comes from groups that have only been collected at the group level, then I will suggest that all you need to do is just to present them with this book and ask them if they know it. And if not, then you could probably recommend them to read it. And I think this is an important point to highlight, because one of the points of the book of course, for academy, but I think also at the personal level, is that nobody can claim to know anything about you unless two things happen, or one of two things happen, is that they have properly studied your individuality, or at least, of course, they have a certain their knowledge sufficiently by studying individuals and not just groups. So whatever they are claiming has to fulfill one of these two requirements, I think, and that's the way I see the main message of this book. Now, Professor Lamiell goes deep into all of these topics and possibilities, and one of them is that, of course, people can have beliefs about you, and those beliefs can come from group level or population studies. And of course, one of the points is that that does not equal to have knowledge about you or about an individual in those groups. So if you're doing group-based level analysis or population level studies, that doesn't guarantee that you are actually studying individuals in those groups. That's basically two different methods, two different approaches, and Professor Lamiell goes very carefully through these concepts and their meanings. So of course there are a lot of other themes in this book. They really caught my attention, and honestly they even inspire me in many ways. And I can tell you quickly about them. I mean, one of them, obviously, as a psychologist, is that Professor Lamiell coins or relates to psychology a very particular term, which is he characterizes psychology as incorrigible. So it seems, and he shows, I think, that psychology has not been accepting the critics in recent years, but considering how young psychology is as a field in science, you can really think that it's a big chunk of its history. And the examples that he presents are honestly very, 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 very shocking sometimes. They come from all kinds of psychologists. Some were very prominent in the field, some have had a major influence in what we're doing right now as psychologists. So that's one of the things that caught my attention. And another one, which is related to this, is that he also starts to develop, let's say, goes back and talks about what the founding fathers of psychology were doing at the time. He also, let's say, fixates on certain cases. For example, he addresses a lot the works of William Stern, and you will see that in the book quite often. But the idea I got from this is that he really does a good job in the book explaining how these individuals, these psychologists who were also recognizing, who were working hard to advance the science, they sometimes had to struggle with these conceptual, let's say, questions, and they had to address it with each other. And it turns out that the fact that statisticism is currently in mainstream psychology had to do a lot with how the arguments of the psychologists unfolded, who won the argument or whose argument was accepted and why. And Professor Lamiell does, I think, like I said, a good job in showing this kind of historical developments narrowly, narrowing down everything to the individuals of yeah, not just one, but many of them. So I think that's also worth checking, that there is a grand story to tell, but it has to do, of course, with choices and decision making of individuals. And as you know, to me, that's very important. And one of the last themes that I think is also worth considering, and this is for all of us, is that there are socio-ethical implications to statisticism. And Professor Lamiell goes and clarifies what these are. And yeah, to be honest, I mean, they are quite concerning because they, of course, have to do with the applied aspect of psychology. So psychology has many branches that are applied sciences. So you can start to think about what this means when somebody is falling into statisticism. But okay, so I could go on, but we should be brief in this video. So I hope at least I got you curious about the book. I would love to hear about your opinion about this video, about this topic, what you have heard about it, or what you have not heard about it. And of course, even better, maybe about the book itself. So, well, yeah, before I go, just one announcement is that I was so taken by this book that I dared to contact Professor James Lamiell, and I asked him for a chance to have a conversation, some kind of interview with him about this book. And yeah, I mean, I was happy to know that he accepted. So if you are interested, just stay tuned and you will probably have the chance to see the output of this conversation in this channel very soon. So yeah, thank you so much for watching this video and see you later.